12:15 noon on Tuesday, September 12, 71 delegates gathered in the chamber of the State House of Representatives in Phoenix, Arizona. A sign near the entrance featured an official logo that bore a gold-plated inscription, Article 5, History in the Making. Nominated by 19 Republican state legislatures, the men and women in Phoenix, all of whom, the Arizona Republic said, appeared white, assembled to organize a convention of the states, a never-before-tried method for amending the U.S. Constitution. "Some are saying about us, they are no Hamilton. They are no Jefferson," said Kelly Townsend, the Arizona state representative who served as chair of the Phoenix convention, speaking to a reporter. "No, we are not. But we are the stewards now. They found the courage to stand up, and now it's our turn. The U.S. Constitution is the most difficult to alter of any in the world. Article 5 lays out 2 ways to propose amendments, with the support of 2/3 of both houses of Congress, or by a convention of states called by Congress upon the request of 2/3 of the states. Whichever way it's put forward, an amendment then has to be approved by 3/4 of the states, either by special conventions or by both houses of the state legislatures, save for Nebraska, which has a single chamber. The first method for proposing an amendment, the one that begins with Congress, has been employed all 27 times the Constitution has been changed. In the nearly 2.5 centuries since the Constitution was ratified, the second method, a convention of states, has never been used. As its name suggests, the purpose of the Balanced Budget Amendment Planning Convention in Phoenix was to set the ground rules for a future convention that would consider only that single amendment. Pitched as a reasonable constraint on the profligate spending habits of Congress and predicated on long-debunked arguments equating the fiscal responsibilities of a nation with those of a household, the Balanced Budget Amendment has been a decades-long obsession of the conservative movement. Its passage would result in the almost immediate contraction of the federal government, whose expenditures could no longer exceed revenues in any given year. Powerless to borrow its way out of a recession, the government would have to cut spending at the very moment it was most needed. The result would be catastrophic. The hordes have broken through the gates of Washington, D.C., and now we should tear the structure down. Mark Meckler, president of Citizens for Self-Governance. Much of the movement's momentum comes from the American Legislative Exchange Council, the corporate-financed behemoth that pushes conservative legislation through state legislatures. Alec's preferred mode of politicking, writing model bills and finding compliant lawmakers to introduce them, makes it well-suited to coordinate action in dozens of state capitals. Meanwhile, the State Policy Network, a collection of 64 think tanks in 49 states, funded by the Koch, Coors, Davis, and Walton families, produces op-eds and other promotional materials that tout the need for such a convention. 27 states have passed resolutions calling for a convention to propose the measure, according to the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, which helped organize the Phoenix meeting. The tally includes several resolutions passed many decades ago, and some of those states could rescind them as the movement approaches the 2/3 threshold. But supporters are unfazed. A motion passed in Phoenix suggests that the movement's backers hope to hold a convention of states before the end of 2018. That's unlikely, but not impossible. There are 7 states where such a resolution has yet to pass, but where both houses of the legislature are controlled by Republicans, just enough to hit the magic 34. Current issue. View our current issue. Subscribe today and save up to $129. Subscribe. Though it has the most states signed on thus far, the movement for a balanced budget amendment isn't the only one eyeing an Article 5 convention. The Convention of States, CO's, project advocates for one that wouldn't be limited to the balanced budget amendment but would be free to consider other small government reforms. Advised by former South Carolina Senator Jim DeMint, until recently president of the Arch-Conservative Heritage Foundation, the CO's project emerged out of Citizens for Self-Governance, a group started in 2015 by Tea Party impresario Mark Meckler to create the largest grassroots army in the history of the United States. Last January, Meckler explained the Article 5 movement to a conservative paper. The hordes have broken through the gates of Washington, D.C., and now, at this very moment, is the time we should tear the structure down. A motley coalition, ranging from the nonpartisan watchdog group Common Cause to the far-right John Birch Society, has now emerged to prevent an Article 5 convention. In January, Richard Cogan of the left-leaning Center on Budget and Policy Priorities published a study on the potential negative effects of a balanced budget amendment, and otherwise valuable contribution to the debate. The report was spoiled by a sidebar warning that a convention could open up the Constitution to radical and harmful changes. Apparently, in order to criticize a particularly egregious proposal for amending the Constitution, one must also swear off one of the few democratic provisions already in it. The arguments against a convention of states are often ahistorical, relying on mistakenly glorified notions of the 1787 Constitutional Convention. An editorial in the Washington Post last April was typical, suggesting that, while the original convention turned out pretty well, a new one might meet with far more doleful results. The editors were particularly worried that the Constitution's requirement of support from 3/4 of the states to ratify any amendment might itself be tossed aside in a convention. It wasn't altogether implausible, the paper observed. The 1787 Constitutional Convention ditched pre-existing ratification rules. Who is to say a 2018 convention could not? There was nothing particularly sacred about the origin of this government. Algie Simons, a founder of the Socialist Party, writing in 1911. The editorial was referring to a provision in the Articles of Confederation that required the states to unanimously approve any amendments, a stipulation that was ignored by the 1787 convention. But if the Constitution that emerged from those proceedings has worked pretty well for a pretty long time, as the Post argued, why assume that updating it wouldn't turn out just as well? In his report, Cogan noted that the Philadelphia Convention went far beyond its mandate. It did so, of course, to come up with the very document that is now apparently too sacred to revisit. Support progressive journalism. If you like this article, please give today to help fund the nation's work. Donate. This contradiction, praise for actions of the framers, followed by warnings against trying to replicate their efforts, can be found throughout the arguments against a new convention. Just think, the Post urged its readers, of how much could go wrong. Sparsely populated states could impose their will on the majority of Americans who live in densely populated ones. Of course, that's exactly what happened in 1787, and we're still living with the consequences. It's why Wyoming, population 586,000, enjoys the same representation as California, population 39,250,000, in the Senate, and has a disproportionate influence in the Electoral College. It's difficult to imagine a new convention producing a political system more skewed toward rural states than the one we have now. An op-ed in the Post in 2014 offered a more general objection. One can readily imagine a convention leading to extensive log rolling, where delegates backed certain changes to the Constitution in return for others' support for their own preferred changes. A sprawling package of alterations could emerge, designed to build support for the overall package by including the favored fixes of single-issue constituencies. Yet the delegates in Philadelphia in 1787 also backed changes pushed by others in exchange for support for their own favored measures. They too agreed to a sprawling package of alterations. With a few reservations, American schoolchildren are still taught to revere it. 7 years ago, liberals scoffed at the Tea Party for its worshipful invocations of the founders. These days, protesting in 18th-century costume has become one of our few bipartisan practices. Outside the Capitol in Phoenix, an anti-convention demonstrator dressed as Alexander Hamilton told a reporter that his character had been instrumental in writing the Constitution, and we are trying to maintain that Constitution and not have it changed. That, of course, would be the same Alexander Hamilton who worked longer than anyone to repeal the Articles of Confederation and replace them with a constitution more pleasing to the rich. "The Republic is sick," Hamilton wrote in 1781, "and wants powerful remedies." The left wasn't always this historically naive. As the writer Daniel Lazar described in his 1996 book The Frozen Republic, how the Constitution is paralyzing democracy, constitutional change was at the center of the original progressive agenda. Populists called for a system of national referendums, while socialists pushed amendments for a graduated income tax, women's suffrage, and the abolition of the presidential veto. The Progressive Party's Robert La Follette ran for president in 1924 on a platform demanding congressional power to override Supreme Court decisions as well as the election of federal judges. The 17th Amendment, which instituted the popular election of senators, passed in Congress after members were spooked by the growing movement to address the issue via a convention of states. Between 1911 and 1929, there were 18 proposals in Congress to amend Article 5 to lower the bar for new amendments. Meanwhile, intellectuals challenged the infallibility of the founders. There was nothing particularly sacred about the origin of this government which should render any attempt to change it sacrilegious. The journalist Algie Simons, a founder of the Socialist Party, wrote in 1911, 2 years after New Republic co-founder Herbert Croly, in The Promise of American Life, decried the country's insidious tradition of conformity, the tradition that a patriotic American citizen must not in his political thinking go beyond the formulas consecrated in the sacred American writings. "What I do fear is a country that has become convinced it is no longer mature enough to consider amendments to its constitution." Lawrence Lessig, Harvard law professor. Compare that with a 2016 report, ominously titled The Dangerous Path, in which Common Cause professed to sound the alarm about the Article 5 movement. It quoted, approvingly, former Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, who once said that a new convention would be a horrible idea. His reasoning: "This is not a good century to write a constitution, as if we can afford to wait for a better one." Something is seriously wrong when progressives align themselves with the most hidebound originalists, while conservatives embrace the doctrine of a living constitution. The institutional left's opposition to thoroughgoing reform has created a vacuum that's being gleefully filled by the right. During her fall book tour, Hillary Clinton told Vox that an Article 5 convention would be disastrous for our country because it might lead to pull them up by the roots change. That, however, is just what this nation needs, and what the rest of the voters of both parties so obviously seek. Rather than ridicule the efforts to adapt the Constitution for the present day, small d Democrats ought, with eyes wide open, to join them.